Hello everybody and welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Douglas Johnson. I am a yoga teacher, meditation teacher. I'm an ordained minister and a certified Kiloby inquiries facilitator. Today I'd like to talk to you about 5 different kinds of motivation or guidance that we experience as human beings, and what these 5 different types of guidance are and the distinction between them, and try and clear up any confusion there might be between them, because I feel like there is a lot of confusion between these. Before I begin the talk today, though, I'd like to thank all of my patrons on Patreon and everyone who helps support me in doing this work financially. And I'd also like to thank everyone on YouTube who likes, subscribes, shares, and comments, because that helps spread the videos a little further, helps other people see them, and helps spread the word. So thank you. So what are the 5 types of motivation or guidance that we experience as human beings? Well, the first one is tied with our biology, and we just call it biological motivation. So this would include basically our hardwired instincts. It's not to say that we can't transcend these or overcome these with discipline, with effort, with motivation from some of the other things that motivate us, like social programming or spiritual guidance, but these generally come with the human biology or package that we're born with. So biological instincts, I think we're all somewhat familiar with them. These are going to be things like thirst and hunger, sex drive, and even things like the desire for love and affection, appreciation, social interaction, these types of things. Again, it's not to say we can't survive without them. Maybe we can even thrive to a degree without some of these things. But generally what we'll find is if these things are, these needs, these motivations are met, at least as sort of a minimum level of them are satisfied and met, generally we're going to feel happier and be healthier than we would otherwise. So these are basically animal, again, biological animal instincts. We could associate these with like the root chakra, so these sort of base needs that we have. And again, I think they're things we're all familiar with, we all experience on a regular basis. And many of these in the modern setting have been more or less taken care of. So if we're talking about hunger, most people in a modern setting, they don't go hungry. Now they may not be eating right, but when was the last time you were truly actually starving? So I'm not saying it never happens. I'm not saying there aren't people who live in the West who don't go hungry, but more often than not in the modern context, Western culture, if people go hungry, it's by choice. It's because they're fasting. So the next type of motivation that we may be familiar with and experience as human beings is going to be the emotional, the impulsive, the unconscious, and reactive. And a lot of the work we do in yoga is often to try and begin to get a handle on this aspect of motivation. The reason for this is a lot of this motivation comes from trauma. So childhood trauma. It doesn't have to be with a big T, so I'm not saying everyone's had some huge traumatic event, but what we're learning about human beings is even when you're so small, a lot of things can be traumatic that just maybe an everyday occurrence. Maybe your parents had to leave because of an emergency and you're too young to understand. And so you experience a deep level of abandonment. And while the truth is you may have never been abandoned, that experience of abandonment may have created changes in your psyche that are still present to modern day, in the modern day as an adult. And these types of things usually are only really discovered through doing quite a bit of deep spiritual or psychological work on oneself. So these are things like personality traits, again, trauma, conditioning, and culture. So again, a lot of times these are things like reactivity. We hear something and we just have an emotional response to it. Maybe we condemn somebody without thought, without really hearing the whole story or seeing the big picture. We're very quick to just make judgments and decisions without a lot of thought or without contemplating very much. We're willing to make snap judgments without a lot of information. Generally speaking, a more awake perspective when we hear something about somebody on the news or something like that is very often, well, I'm not sure I have enough information to judge. We find a lot of times it's not our job to judge another, that whether we think a politician is guilty or not, we can decide at the ballot box. We might vote for them or vote against them. But a lot of times anything outside of that is oftentimes unnecessary. The ego very often will use judgment as a way of boosting itself up. So again, it doesn't matter if it's people we know or people we don't know, gossip, hearsay. The ego often thrives in this domain, in this area of the unconscious, the emotional, the trauma, personality, cultural or religious dogma. This is really, really fertile ground for the egoic structure to strengthen itself through resistance. So again, many, many spiritual traditions, this is where a lot of the work will be done to try and clean up on this level. You will find in some traditions they try and really get a handle on the first level, the biological, so things like the sexual impulse. You might have a lot of spiritual dogma around trying to rein that in. Some of our other more base instincts, maybe toward tribalism or other things like this, they actually can be either strengthened or weakened through spiritual teaching. So it just depends on the teaching. Some teachings seem to actually encourage a form of tribalism in this sense of an in-group and out-group. And then others seem to teach more of a sort of universal brotherhood of all humanity and maybe even all of existence. So it just depends on the tradition, on the teacher, on sometimes interpretation of Scripture. The next thing that can motivate us and guide us is what we could call the mental or rational realm, logic, reason. And again, sometimes reason and logic can override our more base instincts. Sometimes emotion and logic can also override the emotional, impulsive nature of the sort of second tier motivation, if you will. However, sometimes logic is actually used by the second level. I mentioned this in another talk where sometimes people backward rationalize how they feel. So I might meet somebody and I immediately don't like them. And because that's not logical per se. It's a reaction. It's again coming from probably some sort of trauma, some sort of personality defense fear there. And I immediately don't like them. And then what my mind does is it begins gathering evidence for why I am correct to not like them. And again, this is ego at work here. So that's using our rationality and logic in service of the ego. So while it would be nice if our logic and reason were free from egoic influence, what we'll find very often is it most certainly is not free of egoic influence. And the ego can use the rational, the logical to strengthen its hold on us. Again, if you are someone who's listened to some of my talks, you know that the reason we don't want to strengthen our ego is, generally speaking, the stronger our egoic structure is, the more influence it has over us, the more we will suffer. You could say that suffering is simply a sense of separateness and disconnection, a sense of lack. And again, as we see, the ego can use these two, the emotional and the rational, to actually strengthen its hold on us, to make us have an experience that feels very real, that we are separate, that our needs are not being met, that we are somehow a victim of circumstance, or that perhaps our hatred, again, of another, I don't like that person, and then the mind begins to find all the reasons why we're justified for not liking them, rather than looking for evidence for compassion, again, connection. If I can have empathy for someone, if I can see that maybe their bad behavior, maybe they do behave badly, I can see that their bad behavior is motivated from things that I experience, like fear, then I'm beginning to connect with them, right? I might not have the same fears as them, but if I can understand, oh, this is an emotion that I experience, fear, and if I were afraid of what they are afraid of, then I might do the same thing that they do. Again, this is transcending this sphere, and this is where we can use logic in the other way, right? We can take spiritual teaching and apply it logically. Now, it's nice when spiritual teachings like this happen spontaneously, and they do. At a certain level of development and refinement, we naturally move toward that perspective, unprompted from the outside. We don't have to read a scripture. We don't have to consult with our priest. We don't have to talk to our meditation teacher. We just naturally go there. When someone is treating us poorly or behaving badly, we very naturally see the very human motivations behind the behavior, and we can relate because we're human. And so again, empathy, compassion, very, very powerful in terms of spirituality, connecting, softening, and diminishing the ego's hold over us. The next kind of motivation that we experience is what we could call gut or intuition. This usually comes from experience, but it is on a subconscious, not an unconscious level, but a subconscious level. So unconsciousness, that term as I'm using it here, again, is reactivity, it's cultural conditioning, it's traumatic conditioning, it's things that really we'd rather not have guiding us in general. Yes, some of it may be useful some of the time, but at the very least, we'd like to know it's there. We'd like to know it's operating. But usually, unless people have done some spiritual or psychological work, they're just not even aware of that. They identify so strongly with unconscious and emotional impulses that they actually think that that is a fundamental part of who they are. So this is a very powerful experience when someone realizes, usually through meditative process, that it isn't a fundamental part of who they are. It's not fundamental to their being. So very, very powerful. But subconscious is an integration of oftentimes life experience. So this is something that many people who are highly trained in a field, they begin to experience this sort of intuition, a gut feeling. An interesting book I read by Malcolm Gladwell called Blink explores this idea how we can have these hunches, especially someone who is very well trained or skilled in a field. They can experience a hunch that very often is actually correct. But these hunches, even these hunches, can go awry as well. So it's not 100%, and it can be hijacked or it can be an error. But there's something to it. It's not to say it's 100% accurate or it's always right, but if you have a lot of experience in a field, then you may begin to experience this sort of intuition. And that's coming from a more powerful part of your mind. Most people don't realize that modern science says that our subconscious is 1 million times more powerful than the conscious mind. We human beings, we experience this little sliver of information called the conscious mind. And most of us fool ourselves into thinking that that little sliver is way more knowledgeable and powerful than it actually is. So people who very often are at a high degree of accomplishment in a field, they aren't simply using their conscious. They've learned how to access this level of gut intuition. Now again, the reason I wanted to do the talk today was because people often who are motivated by emotion think that they are motivated by this sort of gut intuition. They will break up with a partner for no reason. And well, it just didn't feel right. Again, they may think they're being guided by this deeper intuition, but very often they're actually just being guided by their unconscious fears, their unconscious motivations, not the subconscious guidance, which works on a higher level or a higher plane of understanding. So again, generally speaking, the unconscious, through spiritual work, through psychological work, we would basically like to eliminate this, or at least be aware of when we're under its influence. It may not be possible to get rid of it right away, but we'd like to know, okay, this is that conditioning or pattern that I have. I need to be very mindful about what I say, what I do under its sway. And we can often tell when we're under its sway, again, because we're very often emotional. This is what Eckhart Tolle would call pain body, the unconscious. So far we've covered the physical or biological aspect, the unconscious. Again, Eckhart would call this pain body. This is our trauma. This is our emotions and impulsivity, these types of things. Then we have our logic and reason. But again, logic and reason, many people who think they're motivated purely by logic and reason are actually just used by the mind to justify the emotional. So again, logic, reason can be very, very tricky. I don't think we as human beings are particularly rational beings, even the ones that think that they are. Oftentimes, you'll find that they are still very much motivated by how they feel, and they will use the mind and rationality and logic to justify how they feel, right? As evidence for why they feel is the correct thing to feel, why they're justified in feeling it. Then we have the subconscious. This is what we could call gut instinct, intuition. This again is not infallible. It is definitely fallible. But usually it's not coming from an egoic place. It's much more of a just coming from experience. And it is sort of on a higher function than the other three, generally speaking. And again, it usually comes from having a highly developed awareness in a field. Sometimes people develop this awareness without even knowing it. So I'm not even saying that you would be conscious that you have this ability, but you might find that you can trust your gut, right? You can trust your intuition, and more often than not, it works out, which again is very different. So again, subconscious versus unconscious, which is what we'd like to do away with for the most part. So the final motivator is, you could say, the highest, and this is true intuition. We could call it knowledge, spiritual knowledge. The experience of this is completely different than the others. And I'll say from my own experience, it's possible to live your whole life and never experience this level of guidance. Now, I do believe it's accessible to everybody, but many people have so much conditioning and ego that they don't experience this level of guidance. So for those who've never experienced it, I'll describe the experience a little bit to you. One of the best descriptors for this is a download. It is a download of knowledge that has nothing to do with past, future, has nothing to do with logic. It doesn't necessarily make sense from a humanistic perspective, a rational perspective, an emotional perspective. But when you receive one of these downloads, there's no question in your mind of the truth of it. You just realize that all you can do is acknowledge that that is true. I suppose you could afterwards talk yourself out of it or question it, but very often in my experience, these downloads become almost like a North Star, a guiding principle, a transcendent truth that we may not be able to see, again, given the very, very limited understanding of human consciousness. So if we look at the human mind as the conscious mind is, again, this tiny sliver, really not very powerful, that is what most of us are using to guide us. We have the unconscious, which honestly for many people is actually the main motivator for their behavior. Their traumas, their cultural conditioning, these sorts of things, which is unfortunate, but this explains a lot of what we see in human culture and life today. Again, some are motivated with the rational, others with the subconscious, which again has a certain kind of grace to it. It operates on a higher order, but it's still, in my experience, and from what I can tell, it's still operating from the individual. It may be a very high order of what that individual can produce. So again, the unconscious mind, we're just even talking about the human brain here, very, very powerful, much more powerful than most of us access most of the time. But it still has its limits. Spiritual knowing, this intuition, this transcends that. And again, it doesn't have to make sense from a human rational perspective because it transcends that perspective on every level. So the biological, the emotional or unconscious, the rational, because again, rationality very often is coming from the conscious mind, which we've established is very, very limited, right? What I can hold in my conscious awareness, very limited. And again, logic, rationality can be used backward to justify all kinds of horrific behavior that human beings do. Then the subconscious, which again has a certain kind of grace to it. This is the kind of knowledge that experts in a field are drawing on, usually through thousands of hours of refinement. The parts of our brain that we normally don't access, normally don't use, they begin to come online and they begin to guide us in a way that the conscious mind is just not able to. The conscious mind is too limited to be able to integrate all of that information. But the trans-rational, the spiritual, again, if we try and make sense of it, if we try and justify it with logic, we try and explain it, you may be able to, but it doesn't come from that place. It doesn't come from experience. I'll share with you an experience of mine that was trans-rational. One day I was in my house. I was in my 20s. I had started meditating several years before. I had already had an awakening experience, a spiritual awakening, very powerful, really changed my perspective completely. And there wasn't any particular event, there wasn't anything happening. I wasn't even meditating at the time. I was just sitting in my home. And I remember this knowing, and that's really the best word I could use to explain it. This very powerful knowing that everything was exactly as it needed to be, despite how I might view them. That was sort of the whole package of what came into me. Again, I wasn't thinking about this. I wasn't contemplating disorder in the world or how horrible people were to one another. I wasn't asking in a prayer for, this wasn't an answer to a prayer. It just came in, and I knew that that was true as much as I could know anything else in life was true. And so this is an example of this. In yoga, they talk about the koshas. And I associate this type of knowing with what's called Vijnanamaya kosha. Now this is what we'd like to access eventually through spiritual practice, more and more of this type of guidance. Less and less of the emotional, traumatic, conditioned, unconscious guidance, pain body, according to Eckhart Tolle again, and more of the subconscious, again, that has a sort of a grace to it, and then this sort of superconscious level. And we can get to a point where we begin to, you could say, almost practice grace, where we're willing to let go of what we think should be happening, what we'd like to happen. We let go of the wheel, and we allow life itself to manifest. Sometimes it's called floating downstream. And we float maybe most of the time, and occasionally we get a strong download about direction. I'll share with you a story from Eckhart's life, since I mentioned him a few times in today's talk. Eckhart had his awakening, and after he woke up, he found himself not really motivated to continue the life he had built. He was an academic. He was working toward a degree of some sort, and he just found himself not motivated. So he eventually quit school and started spending more and more time at a park like this one, just watching the ducks and the geese. He would just sit there for hours in relative stillness and silence, just watching the ducks and geese. And eventually he started teaching spirituality to small groups in his home. So he would have people over, they would gather, he would teach, they would discuss. And he was doing this, but he had a sort of prayer, if you will. I don't know how much Eckhart doesn't seem to talk a lot about God, not in the traditional sense. But he never said, oh, I prayed to God. He just said that he would say, I feel like I could do more. Again, you could say he was saying this to God or Source or to a part of himself, a greater part of himself. I feel like I could be doing more. I feel like I could do more. And he said that this went on for years and nothing happened, nothing changed. He felt like he could do more and everything just continued as it is. Now, if Eckhart had more ego, then he might say, I feel like I could do more. I think I'm going to start a business. I think I'm going to write a book. I think I'm going to, he would cook up some kind of plan. This is what egos do. But he just had this thought, I feel like I could do more, and he just let it sit there. He didn't choose to act. And this is a very enlightened way of being. Well, one day he woke up and he just knew that he needed to sell his home in England and go stay with friends in America. That's all he knew. He didn't know why. It didn't make any sense to him, but this was a very clear directive that was coming to him. Now, Eckhart was clear enough that he just followed this intuition. He didn't question it. He didn't ask to know why. Later, when he got to the United States, once he was in California, he sat down at a cafe and he started writing. And he thought, oh, okay, maybe I'm here to write a book. Then he had to go home at one point to renew his visa. And he did. And when he arrived back in London, he couldn't write anymore. Even though he was in the middle of the book, he couldn't write anymore. And that's when he realized, okay, there's something about the energy in California. And if you've ever read his book, it is a very sort of new agey, very California spirituality friendly book. It's very deep, but it's very accessible in a sort of new age spiritual perspective. It's easy for someone with a new age background and perspective to read his book and assimilate and understand some of these very deep spiritual concepts. That's part of the reason that he's such a great teacher. So after his trip back home to London, he realized, oh, there's something about the energy in California. When he got back, he was able to write. He eventually finished the book. Now, during the process of writing the book, he started running out of money. And after he submitted the book, he basically was out of money. He was waiting for, I think, the advance on the book. And he went and he played one single lottery card. And he got enough money to survive until he got his advance on the book. So again, a great example of someone who is able to really trust and to be guided by that knowing. When the knowing comes, some of us may experience this, but we may just push it aside out of fear because we aren't as clear as Eckhart is. We might have a knowing that we are supposed to be doing something. And for us, that voice might be so buried and quiet and stifled that we just assume this is some childhood dream or some silliness on our part. But Eckhart's example is a great example of what's possible for us as human beings if we do the spiritual work. This is ideally where we as human beings operate from. It's possible for us to operate on this level. I don't want you to hear Eckhart's story and think, oh, that's only for Eckhart Tolle. I can't experience that. I can never get to that place. No. The message is that we can all get there, where we're guided by spirit more and more and more. Why would you want this? Well, because generally speaking, being guided by ego being guided by fear, being guided by the narrative of separation, again, it doesn't lead to fulfillment, contentment, happiness, joy, not in a lasting sense. Whereas being guided by spirit, there's no higher experience of the joy of being alive than that. When we really surrender and float downstream and we trust, then it really doesn't matter whether we experience greatness or not. Eckhart is both a good example and a bad example, because he's a good example because everybody knows who he is. Most people do anyway. But he can be a bad example because then people think, oh, if I float downstream, I'm going to write a great spiritual book and I'm going to become world famous. That's not for everybody. We can't all be famous, because then being famous wouldn't mean anything anymore. So what is your path? Maybe it is to be famous. Maybe it is to achieve excellence in some field. But for many of us, our path is going to be very humble. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's quite beautiful. And when you experience maybe a humble life, but with that fullness that Spirit fills you with when you are guided by Spirit, there's no greater joy. Whether you're famous or not, whether you're rich or not, whether you've done something great or not, there is no higher experience for a human being living out her life than being guided by Spirit. One of my teachers used to say, let the Shakti guide you, right? Again, Shakti is our life force, spiritual energy. And what he was pointing to was, at a certain level of spiritual development through meditation, we can be guided more and more by this. So everyone, I'd like to thank you for listening. Please share with me your experience with these 5 levels of motivation. What do you find motivates you in your life? Have you ever considered it? Is it just, again, sort of base survival? Nothing wrong with that. We do need to survive. We have some basic needs as human beings that, when they are met, again, we are happier, we are healthier, we can start to think about other things. I don't really think we are meant to go without these. Most people anyway, most of the time. Then we reach, again, the messy, emotional, unconscious pain body level of motivation. Unfortunately, this is where many people live. And again, they use rationality to justify this, their behavior, why they're doing what they're doing, why they should feel the way that they feel. I think this is a mistake. And hopefully with proper spiritual or psychological guidance, you can free yourself of that bondage, because it really is bondage. The logical, rational, again, it can sort of go either way. It can be used to justify our lower, baser impulses from the unconscious, but it can also guide us toward higher levels of motivation. Then we have the subconscious. Again, this sort of grace that athletes and artists and experts in a field tend to cultivate. This, again, is still in the realm of sort of human accomplishment. This is something that we just get through experience. And then the higher intuition, the spiritual. And this is something we're all born with. We all have it. We all could access it. But for most of us, at least currently, through our upbringing, this is masked. This still small voice, if you will, is masked and is oftentimes muted. So we don't really hear it very clearly. And again, some people might go their whole life without ever really hearing this very clearly. So again, thank you to all my patrons on Patreon. Thank you to everyone on YouTube who likes, subscribes, comments. Again, I'd love to hear your experience with these 5 levels of human motivation. If you have any questions, please reach out. And if you'd like to work with me one-on-one, please inquire and we can schedule a time so that I can help you with inquiry, meditation, personal counseling, spiritual guidance, anything along those lines. Until next time, everyone, namaste and have a beautiful day.